Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. So today we'll be continuing my read aloud of The Infernal Devices Clockwork Angel by Cassandra Clare with Chapter 8. But before we begin the reading, I just have to make the quick disclaimer that I don't own any of the text being presented here, nor am I trying to present any of the text as my own. This is all simply a read aloud that I'm doing on this channel for entertainment purposes, and everything is in fair use. And of course, everything in the Infernal Devices trilogy, as well as everything in the Shadowhunters Chronicles, is owned by Cassandra Clare. So, this is The Infernal Devices Clockwork Angel by Cassandra Clare. Chapter 8, Camille. Fruits fail and love dies and time ranges. Thou art fed with perpetual breath, and alive after infinite changes, and fresh from the kisses of death, of lang hours rekindled and rallied, of barren delights and unclean, things monstrous and fruitless, a pallid and poisonous queen. Algernon Charles Swinburne, Dolores. Tessa was only halfway down the corridor when they caught up to her, Will and Jem walking on either side of her. You didn't really think we weren't going to come along, did you? Will asked, raising his hand and letting the witchlight flare up between his fingers, lighting the corridor to daylight brightness. Charlotte, hurrying along ahead of them, turned and frowned, but said nothing. I know you can't leave anything well enough alone, Tessa replied, looking straight ahead. But I thought better of Jem. Where Will goes, I go, Jem said good-naturedly. And besides, I'm as curious as he is. That hardly seems a subject for boasting. Where are we going? Tessa added, startled, as they reached at the end of the corridor and turned left. The next hall stretched away behind them into unprepossessing shadow. Have we turned the wrong way? Patience is a virtue, Miss Grey, said Will. They had reached a long corridor that sloped precipitously downward. The walls were bare of tapestries or torches, and the dimness made Tessa realize why Will had carried his witchlight stone. This corridor leads to our sanctuary, said Charlotte. It is the only part of the institute that is not on hallowed ground. It is where we meet with those who, for whatever reason, cannot enter hallowed ground, those who are cursed, vampires, and the like. It is also often a place we choose to shelter downworlders who are in danger from demons or other denizens of the shadow world. For that reason, there are many protections placed on the doors, and it is difficult to enter or exit the room without possessing either a stele or the key. Is it a curse, being a vampire? Tessa asked. Charlotte shook her head. No, we think it is a sort of demon disease. Most diseases that affect demons are not transmissible to human beings, but in some cases, usually through a bite or a scratch, the disease can be passed on. Vampirism, lycanthropy, demon pox, said Will. Will, there's no such thing as demon pox, and you know it, Charlotte said. Now, where was I? Being a vampire isn't a curse, it's a disease, Tessa filled in. But they still can't enter hallowed ground then? Does that mean they're damned? That depends on what you believe, said Jem, and whether you even believe in damnation at all. But you hunt demons. You must believe in damnation. I believe in good and evil, said Jem, and I believe the soul is eternal. But I don't believe in the fiery pit, the pitchforks, or the endless torment. I do believe you can threaten people into goodness. Tessa looked at Will. What about you? What do you believe? Pulvis et umbra sumus, said Will, not looking at her as he spoke. I believe we are dust and shadows. What else is there? Whatever you believe, please don't suggest to Lady Belcourt that you think she is damned, said Charlotte. She had come to a halt where the corridor ended in a set of high iron doors, each carved with a curious symbol that looked like two pairs of back-to-back C's. She turned and looked at her three companions. She has very kindly offered to help us, and there's no purpose in offering her such insults. That applies to you especially, Will. If you can't be polite, I'll send you out of the sanctuary. Jem, I trust you to be your charming self. Tessa? Charlotte gave her a grave. Charlotte turned her grave, kind eyes on Tessa. Try not to be frightened. She drew an iron key from the pocket of her dress and slid it into the lock of the door. The head of the key was in the shape of an angel, with outspread wings. The wings gleamed at once, briefly, as Charlotte turned the key, and the door swung open. The room beyond was like the vault of a treasure house. There were no windows and no doors save the one they had entered through. Enormous stone pillars held up a shadowed roof, illuminated by the light of a row of burning candelabras. The pillars were carved all around with loops and scrolls of runes, forming intricate patterns that teased the eye. Huge tapestries hung down from the walls, each one slashed with the figure of a single rune. There was a great gilt-framed mirror, too, making the place seem twice as large. A massive stone fountain rose in the middle of the room. It had a circular base, and in the center of the statue of an angel with folded wings. Rivers of tears poured from its eyes and plashed into the fountain below. Beside the fountain, between two of the massive pillars, stood a group of chairs upholstered in black velvet. The woman who sat in the tallest of the chairs was slender and stately. A hat was tipped forward on her head, balancing a massive black plume at its top. Her dress was of rich red velvet, her icy white skin swelling gently over the fitted bodice, though her chest never rose or fell with a breath. A rope of rubies wound around her throat like a scar. Her hair was thick and pale blonde, clustered in delicate icy curls around her nape. Her eyes were a luminous green that shone like a cat's. Tessa caught her breath. So downworlders could be beautiful. "Douse your witchlight, Will," Charlotte said under her breath, before hurrying forward to greet her guest. "So good of you to wait for us, baroness. I trust you have found the sanctuary comfortable enough for your tastes?" "As always, Charlotte." Lady Belcourt sounded bored. She had a faint accent Tessa couldn't identify. "Lady Belcourt, please let me introduce you to Miss Teresa Gray." Charlotte indicated Tessa, who, not knowing what else to do, inclined her head politely. She was trying to remember how one addressed baronesses. She rather thought it had something to do with whether they were married to barons or not, but she couldn't exactly recall. "Beside us, Mr. James Carstairs, one of our young shadow hunters, and with him is—" But Lady Belcourt's green eyes were already resting on Will. "William Harrendale," she said, and smiled. Tessa tensed, but the vampire's teeth seemed absolutely normal, no sign of sharpened incisors. "Fancy you coming to greet me. You know each other?" Charlotte looked astonished. William won 20 pounds at me. William won 20 pounds for me at Faro," said Lady Belcourt, her green gaze lingering on Will in a way that made Tessa's neck prickle. "A few weeks ago, in a downworlder gambling house run by the Pandemonium Club." "He did?" Charlotte looked at Will, who shrugged. "It was part of the investigation. I was disguised as a foolish mundane who had come to the place to partake in vice," explained Will. "I would have aroused suspicion had I refused to gamble." Charlotte set her chin. "Nevertheless, Will, that money you won was evidence. You should have given it to the clave. I spent it on gin." "Will!" Will shrugged. "The spoils of vice are a burdensome responsibility. Yet one you seem strangely able to bear," observed Jem with an amused flash in his silvery eyes. Charlotte threw up her hands. "I will deal with you later, William. Lady Belcourt, am I to understand that you are also a member of the Pandemonium Club?" Lady Belcourt made a dreadful face. "Certainly not. I was at the gambling house that night because a warlock friend of mine was hoping to win a little easy money at cards. The club's events are open to most downworlders. The members like us to appear there, it impresses the mundanes and opens their pocketbooks. I know there are downworlders running the enterprise, but I would never become one of them. The entire business seems so déclassé." "DeQuincy is a member," said Charlotte, and behind her large brown eyes, Tessa could see the light of her fierce intelligence. "I've been told he is the head of the organization, in fact. Did you know that?" Lady Belcourt shook her head, clearly uninterested in this piece of information. "DeQuincy and I were close years ago, but no longer, and I've been direct with him about my lack of interest in the club. I suppose he could be the head of the club. It's a ridiculous organization, if you ask me, but doubtless very lucrative." She leaned forward, folding her slim, gloved hands in her lap. There was something oddly fascinating about her movements, even the smallest ones. They had a strange animal grace. It was like watching a cat as it slunk through the shadows. "The first thing you must understand about DeQuincy," she said, "is that he is the most dangerous vampire in London. He has made his way to the top of the city's most powerful clan. Any vampire living within London is subject to his whim." Her scarlet lips thinned. "The second thing you must understand is that DeQuincy is old even for one of the Night Children. He lived most of his life before the Accords, and he loathes them and loathes living beneath the yoke of the law. And most of all, he hates the Nephilim." Tessa saw Jem lean in and whisper something to Will, whose mouth quirked up at the corner in a smile. "Indeed," Will said. "How can anyone despise us when we are so charming?" "I am sure you know that you are not loved by most downworlders." "But we thought DeQuincy was an ally." Charlotte rested her thin, nervous hands on the back of one of the velvet chairs. "He has always cooperated with the Clave. Pretense. It is in his interest to cooperate with you, so he does. But he would happily see you all sunk fathoms below the sea." Charlotte had gone pale, but rallied. "And you know nothing of his involvement with two women called the Dark Sisters? Nothing of his interest in automatons? Mechanical creatures?" "Ugh, the Dark Sisters!" Lady Belcourt shuddered. "Such ugly, unpleasant creatures. Warlocks, I believe. I avoided them. They were known to provide for the members of the club who might have less savory interests. Demon drugs, downworld prostitutes, that sort of thing. And the automatons?" Lady Belcourt fluttered her delicate hands in a bored fashion. "If DeQuincy has some fascination with watch parts, I know nothing of it. In fact, when you first contacted me about DeQuincy, Charlotte, I had no intention of coming forward with any information at all. It is one thing to share a few downworld secrets with the Clave, another thing entirely to betray the most powerful vampire in London. That was, until I heard about your little shapeshifter." Her green eyes came to rest on Tessa. The red lips smiled. "I can see the family resemblance." Tessa stared. "The resemblance to whom?" "Why, to Nathaniel, of course. Your brother." Tessa felt as if ice water had been dumped down the back of her neck, shocking her to full alertness. "You've seen my brother?" Lady Belcourt smiled, the smile of a woman who knows she holds a room in the palm of her hand. "I saw him a few times at various Pandemonium Club occasions," she said. He had that hapless look about him. Poor creature, of a mundane under a spell, probably gambled away everything he had. They always do. Charlotte told me the Dark Sisters took him. That doesn't surprise me. They love to drive mundane into the ground with depth and then collect in the most shocking ways. But he's alive? Tessa said. You've seen him alive? It was some time ago, but yes. Lady Belcourt gave a wave of her hand. Her gloves were scarlet, and her hands looked as if they had been dipped in blood. To return to the matter at hand, she said, we were speaking of DeQuincy. Tell me, Charlotte, did you know he holds parties at his townhouse in Charlton Square? Charlotte took her hands off the chair back. I've heard it mentioned. Unfortunately, said Will. It seems he neglected to invite us. Perhaps our invitations went astray in the post. At these parties, Lady Belcourt went on, humans are tortured and killed. I believe their bodies are dumped into the Thames for the mudlarks to pick over. Now, did you know that? Even Will looked taken aback. Charlotte said, but the murder of humans by the Night Children is forbidden under the law, and DeQuincy despises the law. He does this as much to mock the Nephilim as he enjoys the killing. Though he does enjoy that. Make no mistakes about it. Charlotte's lips were bloodless. How long has this been going on, Camille? So that was her first name, Tessa thought. Camille. It was a French-sounding name. Perhaps I explained her accent. At least a year, perhaps longer. The vampire's tone was cool, indifferent. And you are telling me this only now because... Charlotte sounded hurt. The price for revealing the secrets of the Lord of London is death, Camille said, her green eyes darkening. And it would have done you no good. Even if I had told you, DeQuincy is one of your allies. You have no reason and no excuse to burst into his home as if he were a common criminal. Not with no evidence of wrongdoing on his part. My understanding is that, under these new accords, A vampire must actually be observed harming a human before the Nephilim can take action? Yes, Charlotte said reluctantly. But if we had been able to attend one of the parties, Camille let out a short laugh. DeQuincy would never let that happen. At the first sight of a shadow hunter, he would have locked the place up tightly. You would never have been permitted to enter. But you could, Charlotte said. You could have brought one of us with you. The plume on Camille's hat trembled as she tossed her head. And risk my own life? Well, you're not precisely alive, are you? Said Will. I value my existence as much as you do, Shadowhunter, said Lady Belcourt, narrowing her eyes. A lesson you would do well to learn. It could hardly hurt the Nephilim to cease thinking that all those who do not live exactly as they do must therefore not truly live at all. It was Jem who spoke then, for what seemed like the first time since they had entered the room. Lady Belcourt, if you'll pardon my asking, what is it exactly that you want from Tessa? Camille looked directly at Tessa then, her green eyes as brilliant as jewels. You can disguise yourself as anyone, is that correct? A perfect disguise. Appearance, voice, and manner? That's what I have heard. Her lips curled. I have my sources. Yes, Tessa said hesitantly. That is, I have been told the disguise is identical. Camille looked at her narrowly. It would have been perfect if you were to disguise yourself as me. As you? Charlotte said. Lady Belcourt, I see, said Will immediately. If Tessa were disguised as Lady Belcourt, she could make her way into one of DeQuincy's parties. She could observe him breaking the law. Then the Clave would attack, without shattering the accords. Quite the little strategist you are, Camille smiled, revealing her white teeth once again. And it would also provide a perfect opportunity to search DeQuincy's residence, said Jem. See what we can discover about his interest in these automatons. If it really has been murdering mundanes, there's no reason to think that it wasn't for more purposes than mere sport. He gave Charlotte a meaningful look, and Tessa knew what he was thinking, as she was, of the bodies in the cellar of the dark house. We would have to figure out some way to signal the clay from inside DeQuincy's, Will mused, his blue eyes already alight. Perhaps Henry could devise something. It would be invaluable to have a blueprint of the house's construction. Will! Tessa protested. I don't. And of course you wouldn't be going alone, Will said impatiently. I would go with you. I wouldn't let anything happen to you. Will, no, Charlotte said. You and Tessa alone in a house full of vampires? I forbid it. Then who would you send in with her, if not me? Will demanded. You know I can protect her, and you know I'm the right choice. I could go. Or Henry. Camille, who had been watching all this with a look of mixed boredom and amusement, said, I'm afraid I agree with William. The only individuals admitted to these parties are DeQuincy's close friends, vampires, and the human subjugates of vampires. DeQuincy has seen Will before, passing as a mundane, fascinated by the occult. He won't be surprised to find that he's graduated to vampiric servitude. Human subjugate. Tessa had run of them in the Codex. Subjugates, or darklings, were mundanes who had sworn themselves to the service of a vampire. For the vampire, they provided companionship and food, and in return received small transfusions of vampire blood at intervals. This blood kept them bound to their vampire master, and also ensured that when they died, they would become vampires as well. But Will is only 17, Charlotte protested. Most human subjugates are young, said Will. Vampires like to acquire the subjugates when they're youthful, prettier to look at, and less chance of diseased blood, and they'll live a bit longer, though not much. He looked pleased with himself. Most of the rest of the Enclave wouldn't be able to pass convincingly as a handsome young human subjugate. Because the rest of us are all hideous, are we? Jem inquired, looking amused. Is that why I can't do it? No, Will said. You know why it can't be you. He said it without any inflection, and Jem, after looking at him for a moment, shrugged and looked away. I'm not really sure about this, Charlotte said. When is the next of these events set to happen, Camille? Saturday night. Charlotte took a deep breath. I'll have to speak to the Enclave before I can agree, and Tessa would have to agree as well. Everyone looked at Tessa. She licked her dry lips nervously. You believe, she said to Lady Belcourt, that there's a chance my brother might be there? I cannot promise he will be there. He might, but someone there will likely know what has happened to him. The Dark Sisters were regulars at DeQuincy's parties. Doubtless they are their cohorts. If captured and interrogated, will yield you some answers. Tessa's stomach churned. I'll do it, she said, but I want to be promised that if need is there, we'll get him out, and if he isn't, we'll find out where he is. I want to make sure it's not all about catching DeQuincy. It must be about saving Nate, too. Of course, Charlotte said. But I don't know, Tessa. It will be very dangerous. Have you ever changed yourself into a downwelder? Will inquired. Do you even know if it's something that would be possible? Charlotte shook her head. I've never done anything like that, but I could try. She turned to Lady Belcourt. Could I have something of yours? A ring or a handkerchief, perhaps? Camille reached her hands behind her head, brushing aside the thick coils of silver blonde hair that lay against her neck and unclasped her necklace. Letting it dangle from her slender fingers, she held out to Tessa. Here, take this. With a frown, Jem stepped forward to take the necklace, and then held it out to Tessa. She felt the weight of it as she took it from him. It was heavy, and the square ruby pendant, the size of a bird's egg, felt cool to the touch, as cold as if it had been lying in snow. Closing her hand around it was like closing her fingers around a shard of ice. She took a sharp breath and closed her eyes. It was strange, different this time as the transformation took hold. The darkness rose quickly, wrapping itself around her, and the light she saw in the distance was a cold silver glow. The chill that flowed from the light was scalding. Tessa drew the light toward her, surrounding herself with its icy burning light, pushing herself through to the core of it. The light rose in shimmering white walls around her. She felt a sharp pain then, in the center of her chest, and for a moment her vision went red, deep scarlet, the color of blood. Everything was blood-colored, and she began to panic, finding her way free, her eyelids flying open, and she was there again in the sanctuary room, with all the others staring at her. Camille was smiling slightly. The others looked startled, if not as thunderstruck as they had when she had transformed into Jessamine. But something was terribly wrong. There was a great hollow emptiness inside her. Not pain, but a cavernous sense of something missing. Tessa choked, and a searing shock went through her. She sank down into an armchair, her hands pressed against her chest. She was trembling all over. Tessa! Jem sank down onto his heels beside the chair, taking one of her hands. She could see herself in the mirror that hung on the opposite wall, or more accurately, she could see the image of Camille. Camille's shimmering pale hair, unpinned, rained down over her shoulders, and her white skin swelled and spilled over the bodice of Tessa's now too-tight dress in a way that would have made Tessa flush, if she could have flushed. But blushing required blood actually running in one's veins, and she remembered with the dawning terror that vampires did not breathe, did not get hot or cold, and did not have hearts that beat in their chests. So that was the hollowness, the strangeness that she felt. Her heart was still, in her chest like a dead thing. She took another sobbing breath. It hurt, and she realized that while she could breathe, her new body did not want or need to. Oh God, she said in a soft whisper to Jem. My heart's not beating. I feel as if I've died. Jem! He stroked her hand carefully, soothingly, and looked up at her with his silver eyes. The expression in them had not changed with the change in her. He looked at her as he had before, as if she were still Tessa Gray. You're alive, he said, in a voice so soft only she could hear it. You're wearing a different skin, but you're Tessa, and you're alive. Do you know how I know that? She shook her head. Because you said the word God just now to me. No vampire could say that. He squeezed her hand. Your soul is still the same. She closed her eyes and sat still for a moment, concentrating on the pressure of his hand on hers, his warm skin against hers that was icy cold. Slowly the trembling that shook her body began to fade. She opened her eyes and gave Jem a faint, shaky smile. Tessa? Said Charlotte. Is everything all right? Tessa drew her eyes away from Jem's face and looked at Charlotte, who was watching her with an anxious gaze. Will, beside Charlotte, wore an unreadable expression. You will have to practice a bit, moving and holding yourself if you wish to convince DeQuincy that you are me, Lady Belcourt said. I would never slump in a chair like that. She tilted her head to the side. Still, overall, an impressive showing. Someone trained you well. Tessa thought of the Dark Sisters. Had they trained her well? Had they done her a favor unlocking this dormant power inside her, despite how much she had hated them and it? Or would it have been better if she had never known that she was different? Slowly she let go, let the Camille skin slip away from her. It felt as if she were rising up out of icy water. Her hand tightened on Gem's as the chill ran through her, head to toe, a freezing cascade. Something leaped inside her chest then, like a bird that has lain stunned and motionless after flying into a window, only to gather its strength and leap from the ground to soar into the air. Her heart began suddenly to beat again. Air filled her lungs, and she released Gem, her hands flying to her chest, her fingers pressed against the skin to feel the soft rhythm beneath. She looked in the mirror across the room. She was herself again, Tessa Gray, not a miraculously beautiful vampire. She felt an overwhelming relief. My necklace? My necklace? Lady Belcourt said coolly and held out her slender hand. Gem took the ruby pendant from Tessa to bring it to the vampire. As he lifted it, Tessa saw that there were words etched on the silver frame of the pendant. Amor veris nequam moritur. She looked across the room at Will, who wasn't sure why, only to find that he was looking back at her. They both glanced hastily away. Lady Belcourt, Will said, since none of us have ever been in DeQuincy's home, do you think it would be possible for you to provide us a floor plan, or even a sketch of the grounds and rooms? I shall provide you with something better. Lady Belcourt raised her arms to clasp the necklace around her throat. Magnus Bane. The warlock? Charlotte's eyebrows rose. Indeed, said Lady Belcourt. He knows the house as well as I do, and is often invited to be DeQuincy's DeQuincy's social events. Though, like me, he has formally eschewed the parties at which murder is committed. Noble of him, muttered Will. He will meet you there, and guide you through the house. No one there will be surprised to see us together. Magnus Bane is my lover. You see? Tessa's mouth opened slightly. This was not the sort of thing ladies said in polite company, or any company. But perhaps it was different for vampires? Everyone else looked as stunned as she did, except Will, who, as usual, looked as if he were trying not to laugh. How nice, Charlotte said at last, after a pause. Indeed it is, Camille said, and rose to her feet. And now, if someone will escort me out. It grows late, and I have not yet fed. Charlotte, who was regarding Tessa with concern, said, Will, Gem, if you'll go? Tessa watched as the two boys flanked Camille like soldiers, which she supposed was what they were, and followed her from the room. Last through the door, the vampire paused and looked back over her shoulder. Her pale blonde curls brushed her cheeks as she smiled. She was so beautiful that Tessa felt a sort of pang looking at her, overriding her instinctive feeling of aversion. If you do this, Camille said, and you succeed, whether or not you find your brother, I can promise you, little shapeshifter, that you won't regret it. Tessa frowned, but Camille was already gone. She moved so fast that it was as though she had vanished between one breath and the next. Tessa turned toward Charlotte. What do you think she meant by that? That I won't regret it? Charlotte shook her head. I don't know, she sighed. I'd like to think that she meant that the knowledge of a good deed done would console you, but it's Camille, so... Are all vampires like that? Tessa asked. Cold like that? Many of them have been alive a long time, Charlotte said diplomatically. They don't see things the way we do. Tessa put her fingers to her aching temples. Indeed they don't. Of all the things that bothered Will about vampires, the way they moved soundlessly, the low and inhuman timbre of their voices, it was the way they smelled that bothered him most, or rather, the way they didn't smell. All human beings smelled like something, sweat, soap, perfume, but vampires had no scent, like wax mannequins. Ahead of him, Jem was holding the last of the doors that led from the sanctuary to the outer foyer of the Institute. All these spaces had been deconsecrated so that vampires and others of their ilk could use them, but Camille could never have come any further into the Institute than that. Escorting her out was more than a curiosity. They were making sure she didn't accidentally wander onto consecrated ground, which would be dangerous for everyone involved. Camille brushed by Jem, hardly looking at him, and Will followed, pausing only long enough to mutter, "She doesn't smell like anything," to Jem under his breath. Jem looked alarmed. You've been smelling her? Camille, who was waiting by the next doorway for them, turned her head at this and smiled. I can hear everything you say, you know, she said. It is true. Vampires have no scent. It makes us better predators. That's an excellent hearing, Jem said, and let the door swing shut behind Will. They were standing in the small square entryway with Camille now, her hand on the knob of the front door, as if she meant to hurry out. But there was nothing hurried in her expression as she looked them over. Look at you both, she said, all black and silver. You could be a vampire, she said to Jem, with your pallor and your looks, and you, she said to Will. Well, I don't think anyone at DeQuincy's will doubt that you could be my human subjugate. Jem was looking at Camille with that look that Will always thought could cut glass. He said, Why are you doing this, Lady Belcourt? This plan of yours, DeQuincy, all of it. Why? Camille smiled. She was beautiful, Will had to admit, but then a lot of vampires were beautiful. Their beauty had always seemed to him like the beauty of pressed flowers, lovely but dead. Because the knowledge of what he was doing weighed on my conscience. Jem shook his head. Perhaps you are the sort who would sacrifice yourself on the altar of principle, but I doubt it. Most of us do things for reasons that are more purely personal, for love, or for hate, or for revenge, Will said. After all, you've known about what was going on for a year now, and you only just came to us. That was because of Miss Grey. Yes, but that's not all it is it? Jem said. Tessa has your opportunity, but your reason, your motive, is something else. He cocked his head to the side. Why do you hate DeQuincy so much? I don't see what business it is of yours, little silver shadow hunter, Camille said, and her lips had drawn back from her teeth, leaving her fangs visible, like bits of ivory against the red of her lips. Will knew that vampires could show their fangs at will, but it was still unnerving. Why does it matter what my motives are? Will filled in the answer for Jem, already knowing what the other boy had been thinking. Because otherwise we can't trust you. Perhaps you're sending us into a trap. Charlotte wouldn't want to believe it, but that doesn't make it not possible. Lead you into a trap? Camille's tone was mocking, and incurred the terrifying wrath of the clave. Hardly likely. Lady Belcourt, said Jem, whatever Charlotte might have promised you, if you want our help, you will answer the question. Very well, she said. I can see you will not be satisfied until I give you an explanation. You, she said, nodding toward Will, are correct, and you seem to know a curious amount about love and revenge for one so young. We must discuss them some day together. She smiled again, but the smile did not reach her eyes. I had a lover, you see, she said. He was a shapeshifter, a lycanthrope. It is forbidden for the Night Children to love or to lie with the Moon's children. We were careful, but DeQuincy found us out and murdered him, in much the way he will be murdering some poor mundane prisoner at his next party. Her eyes shone like green lamps as she looked at them both. I loved him, and DeQuincy murdered him, and the others of my kind helped and abetted him. I will not forgive them for it. Kill them all. The Accords, now 10 years old, marked a historic moment for both Nephilim and Downworlders. No longer would the two groups strive to destroy each other. They would be united against a common foe, the demon. There were 50 men at the signing of the Accords in Idris, 10 of the Night Children, 10 of Lilith's children, known as Warlocks, 10 of the Fair Folk, 10 of the Moon's children, and 10 of Raziel's blood. Tessa jerked awake at the sound of a knock on her door. She had been half drowsing on the pillow, her fingers still keeping a place in the Shadowhunter's Codex. After setting the book down, she barely had time to sit up and draw the covers about herself before the door opened. In came lamplight, and Charlotte with it. Tessa felt an odd twinge, almost disappointment. But who else had she been expecting? Despite the late hour, Charlotte was dressed as if she planned to go out. Her face was very serious, and there were lines of tiredness below her dark eyes. You awake? Tessa nodded, and lifted the book she had been reading. Reading. Charlotte said nothing, but crossed the room and sat down at the foot of Tessa's bed. She held out her hand. Something gleamed in her palm. It was Tessa's angel pendant. You left this with Henry. Tessa set her book down and took the pendant. She slipped the chain over her head and felt reassured as the familiar weight settled against the hollow of her throat. Did he learn anything from it? I'm not sure. He said it was all clogged up on the inside with years of rust. That it was a wonder it was working at all. He cleaned out the mechanism, though it doesn't seem to have resulted in much of a change. Perhaps it ticks more regularly now? Perhaps. Tessa didn't care. She was just happy to have the angel, the symbol of her mother and her life in New York, back in her possession. Charlotte folded her hands in her lap. Tessa? There is something I haven't told you. Tessa's heart began to beat faster. What is it? Mortmain? Charlotte hesitated. When I said that Mortmain introduced your brother to the Pandemonium Club, that was true, but not the whole truth. Your brother already knew about the Shadow World, before Mortmain ever told him. It seems he learned about it from your father. Stunned, Tessa was silent. How old were you when your parents died? Charlotte asked. It was an accident, Tessa said, a little dazed. I was 3. Nate was 6. Charlotte frowned. So young for your father to confide in your brother. But I suppose it's possible. No, Tessa said. No, you don't understand. I had the most ordinary, the most human upbringing imaginable. Aunt Harriet, she was the most practical woman in the world. She would have known, wouldn't she? She was Mother's younger sister. They brought her with them from London when they came to America. People keep secrets, Tessa, sometimes even from the ones they love. Charlotte brushed her fingers across the cover of the codex, with its embossed seal. And you must admit it does make sense. Sense? It doesn't make any kind of sense. Tessa, Charlotte sighed. You don't know why you have the ability that you do. But if one of your parents was connected in some way to the magical world, doesn't it make sense that the connection might have something to do with it? If your father was a member of the Pandemonium Club, isn't that how DeQuincy might have known about you? I suppose. Tessa spoke grudgingly. It's only I believed so strongly when I first came to London that everything that was happening to me was a dream, that my life before had been real, and that this was a dreadful nightmare. I thought that if only I could find Nate, we could go back to the life we had before. She raised her eyes to Charlotte's. But now I cannot help but wonder if perhaps the life I had before was a dream and all this was the truth. If my parents knew of the Pandemonium Club, if they were part of the Shadow World too, then there is no world I can go back to that will be clean of all this. Charlotte, her hands still folded in her lap, looked at Tessa steadily. Have you ever wondered why Sophie's face is scarred? Caught off guard, Tessa could only stammer. I wondered, but I didn't like to ask. Nor should you, said Charlotte. Her voice was cool and firm. When I first saw Sophie, she was crouched in a doorway, filthy, with a bloody rag clutched to her cheek. She saw me as I went by, even though I was glamoured at the time. That's what drew my attention to her. She has a touch of the sight, as do Thomas and Agatha. I offered her money, but she wouldn't take it. I wheedled her into accompanying me to a tea shop, and she told me what had happened to her. She had been a parlour maid in a fine house in St. John's Wood. Parlour maids, of course, are chosen for their looks, and Sophie was beautiful, which turned out to be both a great advantage and a great disadvantage for her. As you might imagine, the son of the house took an interest in seducing her. She turned him away repeatedly. In a rage, he took a knife and cut open her face, saying that if he couldn't have her, he'd make sure no one ever wanted her again. How awful, Tessa whispered. She went to her mistress, the boy's mother, but he claimed that she'd tried to seduce him, and he'd taken up the knife to fight her off and protect his virtue. Of course they threw her out on the street. By the time I found her, her cheek was badly infected. I brought her here and had the Silent Brothers see to her. But while they cured the infection, they couldn't heal the scar. Tessa put her hand to her own face in a gesture of unconscious sympathy. Poor Sophie. Charlotte cocked her head to the side and looked at Tessa out of her bright brown eyes. She had such a strong presence, Tessa thought, that it was hard to remember sometimes how physically small she was, how bird-like and tiny. Sophie has a gift, she said. She has the sight. She can see what others do not. In her old life, she often wondered if she was mad. Now she knows that she is not mad, but special. There was only a parlour maid. There she was only a parlour maid, who would likely have lost her position once her looks had faded. Now she is a valued member of our household, a gifted girl with much to contribute. Charlotte leaned forward. You look back on the life you had, Tessa. and it seems safe to you in comparison to this one. But you and your aunt were very poor, if I am not mistaken. If you had not come to London, where would you have gone when she died? What would you have done? Would you have found yourself weeping in an alley like our Sophie? Charlotte shook her head. You have a power of incalculable value. You need ask nothing of anyone. You need depend on no one. You are free, and that freedom is a gift. It is hard to think of something as a gift when you have been tormented and imprisoned for it. Charlotte shook her head. Sophie said to me once that she was glad she had been scarred. She said that whoever loved her now would love her true self and not her pretty face. This is your true self, Tessa. This power is who you are. Whoever loves you now, and you must also love yourself, will love the truth of you. Tessa picked up the codex and hugged it against her chest. So you are saying I am right. This is what is real. And the life I had before was the dream. That is correct. Gently, Charlotte patted Tessa's shoulder. Tessa almost jumped at the contact. It had been a long time, she thought, since anyone had touched her in such a motherly fashion. She thought of Aunt Harriet, and her throat hurt. And now it is time to wake up. Oh. Okay. So that chapter was a very interesting one, getting to meet Belcourt in this book, Camille. And we learned that she is indeed Magnus's lover in this story, which we already know given the history between Camille and Magnus. I mean, they were together at the time when Magnus, knew Will and Jem and Tessa and everybody from the London Institute. But what's interesting here was seeing how Tessa can transform into other Downworlders and how she noticed that Camille, when she transformed into Camille, it felt as though her heart were no longer beating and she felt as though she were dead. And that right there was very, very telling. And we saw Camille's demon necklace, the red ruby pendant that Isabel Lightwood eventually wears in the Mortal Instruments books. And we see how Izzy had that necklace passed down to her. But what I find interesting is that Camille also has a grudge against DeQuincy, and that's part of the whole reason why she is even agreeing to help out here, because DeQuincy had her werewolf lover murdered, and all of the vampires in London stood with him. And of course, with Camille, she has every single right to resent DeQuincy for that. But with Camille, with her, whenever she helps out anybody, there's always a cost. There's always something that you must give her in return. And she never does anything out of pure goodness. We already know that from Simon's experience with her during City of Fallen Angels, and we just know for a fact that with Camille Belcourt, she's not a woman that you can trust. I mean, the charm that she has to her makes her just as manipulative as the fairies in the books. But what I do find very interesting here is how she looks at Jem and seems to point out how Jem could very well pass as a vampire. And that right there is very interesting, considering that Jem has a yin-fen addiction, which is vampire blood. And the fact that he's basically, poisoned by this very addictive drug, almost like the opium crisis that we have here in the States. And that right there is just very, very telling. This whole idea of addiction and the fact that Jem is slowly dying due to his dependency on the yin-fen. And then, of course, Will is offering basically to come along and act as a human subjugate so that Tessa can sneak into this party, but they're going to need help from somebody else, and that is Magnus Bane. And Magnus, with him, I'm going to be very curious to see how his interactions are with Will and Jem and Tessa and everything, because we do know that, he considers Tessa to be a dear friend to him, especially in the Mortal Instruments books. They reference her over and over and over again, that Tessa is a very, very good friend of Magnus's. And And I think Magnus is going to actually recognize Tessa's talent as something that has to do with the shapeshifting and also the fact that she is half warlock, because anybody that knows even the littlest bit about Tessa's backstory is that she's a half-breed. She's half warlock, half shadow hunter. And the whole reason why she doesn't have a warlock mark is because the thing that marks her is the runes of a shadow hunter. And I think Magnus is definitely going to recognize that with her, and he's going to feel some sort of kinship with her. I can already see that very clearly in my head, that Magnus is going to sort of try to mentor her and take her in, kind of like how he took in Clare and sort of kind of helped basically be almost like another father figure to Clare, because we all know how Magnus is. He, as cunning and as determined as he is, and as he's filled with so much self-preservation along the way, he does selflessly take in a lot of downworlders, and he does selflessly take in and help so many people. Like, that's just who Magnus is. He has the most golden heart in the entire world, and I'm very, very curious to see how he and Tessa interact in this book in particular. But we also got some information about Sophie and how, you know, her former master's son, her former mistress's son, more or less, you know, tried to seduce her, and he ended up cutting her after she rejected him over and over and over again. But now she's just happy that she has that scar, because there's going to be somebody out there that's going to love her for who she actually is, not what she is, not what she looks like, but love her for what she is on the inside. And I think that right there is a very powerful thing about self-love, about self-acceptance, about accepting who you are, loving who you really are. And I think that that's truly the journey that Tessa is on right now, as she's starting to go through this whole arc of self-acceptance. And I think that all the women characters in the Infernal Devices go through that whole arc of needing to learn to love themselves, accept themselves. Jessamine, though, on the other hand, we already know that she hates herself, and that the only parts of herself that she loves are the human side, but not the angelic side. And she is absolutely shuddering at the idea of needing to wear pants and wield weapons. She says that's not the way a lady is supposed to act. Well, guess what? That's your destiny. And the sooner or later that you learn to love that part of yourself, and you learn to realize how special and amazing you truly are, then guess what? You're never going to have any peace in your life at all whatsoever. And I think that that's very telling of what ends up happening with Jessamine later. I only know a little bit about Jessamine from what I've read, and I'm pretty sure her ghost, her spirit, haunts the London Institute in a way. And that was why when Jonathan Christopher / Sebastian Morgenstern tried to assault the London Institute, Jessamine's spirit, which was locked away there and imprisoned for so many years as a ghost, she clearly had some unfinished business, and she ended up protecting the Institute and making sure that it still stood even after Sebastian tried to, you know, tear it down brick by brick. And I'm very curious to see how that ends up going with Jessamine, because as you guys already know, I don't really like her at all whatsoever. But if somehow her story ends with her eventually having something meaningful, and her being able to provide something meaningful and some type of protection to the Institute, then fine, I'll take it. But right now, it's just impossible for me to like or appreciate Jessamine Lovelace at all whatsoever. But there you have it. That was Chapter 8, Camille. If you guys are brand new to the channel, be sure to subscribe, and also be sure to leave a like on the video and comment down below and let me know your thoughts and opinions on the reading. God bless, happy viewing, and have a nice day, everyone. See ya!